Hi guys, this video is looking at acute responses to exercise. So I'll go through a brief explanation as to what acute responses to exercise actually are, and then we'll look at specifically our respiratory responses to exercise that occur. So starting off talking about what an acute response is, the definition of what that would be is that it's those immediate short-term responses that happen during the exercise session that we are doing, and also for a short period of time after that exercise session. So part of that recovery period is included as our acute responses to exercise. So they occur for that duration and recovery, and what the level of these responses and how they actually occur, it all depends on how hard we are working, so our intensity, how long we are working for, so our duration, and also the type of exercise that we are doing, because if we are doing continuous running versus a strength training session, our bodies are going to respond in very different ways to those two types of things. So we'll have a bit of a look at what happens and when it happens. So the reason we have these acute responses to exercise in the first place is that when we actually start to exercise, we know that our muscles require more energy to be able to resynthesize ATP so that we can actually have muscle contraction occurring for that activity. So what happens as a result of that is we have this increase in oxygen demand for both and also our energy substrate. So we need more fuels and we need more oxygen. We also need to remove more byproducts that are produced. So the way that our body does this during exercise is that our respiratory system will kick into gear, and it'll do things that'll help us increase our oxygen availability. Our cardiovascular system will also increase its rate of work, and it will aim to deliver more oxygen to those working muscles. And then our muscular system, it will do some things that help us get better at using more oxygen that's being delivered to our muscles. So this session will look at what our respiratory responses are specifically. When we are looking at acute responses to exercise, from a PE point of view, there's three things that you need to be able to do for each of these responses that we look at. You need to be able to explain what the response is. So pretty much you need to be able to define the response or explain what is actually happening with that response. Then you need to be able to explain how it changes when we begin to exercise. Majority of the responses that we look at increase, but there are a couple that actually decrease. And then we need to look at why these changes occur. So are they aiming to increase oxygen delivery, increase oxygen availability, those sorts of things. So when I go through this information, there'll be an emphasis on the what, the how, and the why. And if you can do those three things, then you should be able to handle any acute responses to exercise questions that you may come across. So our respiratory responses to exercise, when we start to exercise, there's changes that occur to our respiratory system as soon as we start to exercise, if not just before. So we'll have a look at this thing called anticipatory rise, which happens just before we start to exercise. Our respiratory responses, they occur to meet those energy demands, because when we start to exercise, there's an increase in energy demand. And our lungs are primarily responsible for getting oxygen into our body, but also helping with removing carbon dioxide, so that byproduct of our aerobic energy system. So during exercise, we're requiring more oxygen and we're requiring more carbon dioxide removal. So this process, all of these things, so respiratory rate, etc., they must speed up when we start to exercise. So the purpose of any respiratory response to exercise is to increase the amount of oxygen available in our body. Okay, so its key role is to just get the oxygen in and rely on the other systems to then take it to the muscles and be able to use it and those sorts of things. So it's just making oxygen available. So if you are discussing any respiratory response to exercise, in your answers, I would expect that you would be writing something about the fact that they increase oxygen availability. If you're writing just those three key words at some point in your answer, that's probably going to get you a mark if we're discussing why these responses occur, what's the purpose of them, how do they help us with exercise, all of those sorts of things. Okay, so what can our body do to increase our oxygen availability and decrease our carbon dioxide removal? Things that our body can do include increase in our respiratory rate, an increase in our tidal volume, increase in our ventilation, an increase in our oxygen uptake, and speed up our rates of diffusion. So we're going to talk about these 5 things. So first one I'll talk about is our respiratory rate. And it's simply looking at the number of breaths that we take in 1 minute. So if we were to time 1 minute of exercise, how many breaths you simply take across that 1 minute. It's our most obvious respiratory response to exercise that we can see. When we start to exercise, we breathe more often. So it's a very easy one for us to be able to measure. And it increases with the obvious reason of being able to increase our oxygen available within the body. The reason we have this increase in respiratory rate is that when we start to exercise, we have a slight increase in our carbon dioxide concentration in the blood, and the body senses this increase in carbon dioxide, so it actually triggers an increase in our respiratory rate. And it's that actually gets us getting more oxygen into the body and getting more carbon dioxide out of the body. So it's actually the carbon dioxide that triggers our respiratory rate. It's not a lack of oxygen, it's too much carbon dioxide that triggers this response. Our next response is tidal volume. So looking at the amount of air in litres that is breathed in or out in one single breath. Okay, so we can reword it and just say it's just how deep you breathe. It increases with exercise, again with that purpose of increasing oxygen availability. So when people exercise, some people you'll find they increase their respiratory rate to get more oxygen in. Other people, their bodies respond and actually just take deeper breaths. Either way, there's no right or wrong way that your body tries to increase how much ventilation is getting into our systems. It's just if you're increasing either or both of these things, you're getting more air into the body, which means more oxygen in, which means we're increasing that oxygen availability. Okay, so some people, their bodies respond and they simply just take more breaths, whereas others, they might just take deeper breaths. Our ventilation is how much air in litres we breathe in 1 minute. Okay, so it's the volume of air that we can get into our bodies in 1 minute. We've got a formula here. So our ventilation, it is the product of our tidal volume multiplied by our respiratory rate. Okay, so if we're multiplying these two things together, that's looking at how much air we're getting in across an entire minute. It's important to understand these formulas so you won't have to do calculations, but you should be able to recognize that if we need to increase our ventilation rate, we need to either increase our tidal volume, our respiratory rate, or both of those things to get the resultant increase in our ventilation rate. And it's important that you recognize the units of measurement as well, because if you're writing formulas in an exam, you should include these units of measurement as well. So ventilation increases because we have this increase in tidal volume and respiratory rate, and the aim of those is to meet those oxygen demands of working muscles, so increasing that oxygen availability. Okay, because our body sense that we have more carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions in our bloodstream, the body works to get more oxygen available and remove that carbon dioxide to help combat those byproducts that are being produced. As I mentioned just before, our responses start to happen just slightly before exercise with our ventilation. So if you picture yourself at the start of a 100-meter sprint, what would actually happen naturally without you even trying is that your ventilation rate will increase slightly just before you start that event. So your body senses that it's going to need more oxygen available for what it's about to do. So it starts to increase that ventilation in anticipation of this exercise. So we call that an anticipatory rise. If we look at our ventilation rate across different types of exercise, so different intensities, during submaximal exercise, we'll see our ventilation increase really quickly for the first 4 to 5 minutes of exercise, and then it'll plateau out or just flatten out or level out, and it'll become steady. Okay, so in the next bit of information, we'll look at steady state. Once we've reached a point where we're meeting the oxygen demands of the exercise that we're doing, our ventilation rate will plateau out and just maintain that steady rate. If we're working at maximal exercise, our ventilation will continue to increase throughout the exercise. It won't plateau at any point. Because when we're working maximally, we're working anaerobically and we're not meeting the oxygen demands of what we're doing. So despite how hard our body is working, we are still not getting to that point where we're delivering enough oxygen to meet the demands of that exercise. So it'll continue to increase. This is partly why we can't maintain that maximal exercise for extended periods of time, is that it becomes too stressful for our body in terms of trying to get oxygen to those working muscles. It'll eventually get to this point where, because we've got this relationship of tidal volume times respiratory rate, there's only so much that we can increase our tidal volume. Okay, so our tidal volume has a limited size that it can expand to and a limited amount of air that can actually go into our lungs. So our tidal volume actually plateaus. So the reason our ventilation will continue to increase is because of that increase in respiratory rate. Okay, so if we look at our responses to exercise in this graph, you can see that at low intensity, we've got this anticipatory rise, and very quickly, within 2 minutes, we've reached that ventilation rate that is enough to deliver, to meet the oxygen demands of what we are doing. And very quickly, we return back to our resting levels. If we look at moderate intensity work, it takes us a little bit longer to reach that plateau. Okay, so 3 minutes in this example. And again, it takes us that little bit longer to return back to those resting levels. If we look at vigorous intensity exercise, you can see at no point is there a plateau in our ventilation rate for that type of work. And at the end of exercise, we haven't even after 5 minutes returned back to those resting levels. It might take a little bit longer to get back to those resting levels. Okay, so you can see the different intensity of work will affect the size of our ventilation response to exercise. Okay, so it plateaus when we're working sub-maximally, so during low to moderate intensity work, but in vigorous intensity work, it actually never plateaus. It keeps increasing to the point that we actually can't continue working at that intensity of work. Our next response to exercise is our oxygen uptake. Okay, so this is looking at the amount of oxygen that we can take in, transport, and use for energy production. Okay, so if we're looking at when exercise begins, our oxygen uptake, it increases. Again, because we've got that increased oxygen demand at the working muscles, so we increase our oxygen availability. It's really important to note that oxygen uptake and VO2 max are not the same thing. Okay, so if we were talking about VO2 max, it is our maximum oxygen uptake. Okay, so our maximum VO2. So we'd be looking at the highest point that we can get oxygen in, delivered to and used by the body for energy production. Okay, so we use that as an indication of aerobic fitness. We'll look at VO2 max in more detail later on, and also with our incursion that we've got coming up as well. Okay, so if we're looking at VO2 max and how it VO2, and how it responds to exercise, when we start to exercise, we increase our VO2. So we increase our oxygen uptake because we have this increased oxygen demand at the working muscles. So we need to make more oxygen available in the body. There's a linear relationship. Really important that we understand that there's this linear relationship between oxygen uptake and exercise intensity. So if we look at this graph, as we increase our intensity of work or our speed, so we work harder, we also have an increase in our oxygen uptake. And there's a linear relationship. Regardless of our training status, the harder we work, the more we increase our VO2. The linear increase, that will continue until you reach your maximum levels. Okay, so with our blue line, you can see that it reaches they reach their VO2 max at, say, the 11 kilometre per hour mark, whereas the red line, they actually reach it at, say, that 17 kilometre hours mark. So they can work at a much higher intensity for longer because they have a higher VO2 max. Okay, so to get to that point from their starting point, they can actually work at a higher intensity for a longer period of time. There's no further increase in oxygen uptake that can be achieved beyond our VO2 max. That's not to say that this is the highest intensity that this person can work, because we know that we can get additional energy from our anaerobic systems. Okay, so we can work at 200% of our VO2 max in terms of intensity. Okay, so if this is our VO2 max at 17, we could work at 34 kilometers per hour, but we would not be able to maintain that speed for a very long time because there would be a heavy reliance on our anaerobic systems for energy production. And we know that they both have fatiguing byproducts associated with them. Okay, and that would force us to decrease our intensity of work. Okay, so in terms of our oxygen uptake, there's that linear relationship. As exercise intensity increases, our oxygen uptake increases in proportion to that. Our next, our final respiratory response to exercise we're going to look at is diffusion. Okay, so you could also call it gaseous exchange, and this is looking at diffusion of gases between the capillaries and either the lungs or the muscles. Okay, and as it points out here, a really common mistake that students make is that they think that gaseous exchange this diffusion only happens at the lungs. This also happens at the muscles. Okay, we're just looking at it in this particular instance from a lungs point of view. So looking at the exchange between the capillaries and the alveoli. Okay, so with diffusion, gases always move from areas of high pressure to areas of low pressure. So gases move down a concentration gradient. Okay, so the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide between capillaries and the alveoli, it increases during exercise. So in terms of an answer how you would explain the process of diffusion is that rates of diffusion between the capillaries and the alveoli increase in response to increased energy demands as a result of exercise. So if we look at our little diagram here, we've got alveoli and we've got capillaries. The blood coming from the body has lots of carbon dioxide in it. It has a high concentration of carbon dioxide. And our alveoli that have just breathed in, they have low concentrations of carbon dioxide. So based on the fact that things go from high pressure to low pressure, that carbon dioxide is going to go across the membrane into the alveoli. At the same time, that blood doesn't have a lot of oxygen in it because it's been used by the muscles, but we do have a lot of oxygen in the alveoli, so that alveoli is going to travel down the concentration gradient into the capillaries. So that's how we reoxygenate our blood at the lungs. As I was just saying, the alveoli is high in oxygen and it's low, the capillaries are low in oxygen, so the movement occurs in that direction. And then our capillaries, they're high in carbon dioxide, our alveoli are low in carbon dioxide, so the direction of movement is that way. Okay, so oxygen leaves the alveoli and enters the bloodstream, so that can then be transported around the body to the muscles. And our carbon dioxide leaves the bloodstream so that it can be breathed out. This results in more oxygen available at the muscle, so that's going to allow us to work at higher intensities. And it's also going to allow us to remove carbon dioxide at greater rates as well, which is going to allow us to continue working and doing what we need to do. Okay, so we've looked at our 5 respiratory responses to exercise. We can see that our first 3 here, so respiratory rate, tidal volume and ventilation, they're very closely related. So an increase in one or both of these factors will result in an increase in our ventilation. We looked at the fact that our oxygen uptake increases linearly as we increase our intensity of work. And with our rates of diffusion, if we're getting more oxygen into the lungs because of increased ventilation. That means we have more oxygen traveling down that concentration gradient into the bloodstream. Okay, so you can see how these start to link together. And if we've got greater rates of diffusion, that's going to allow us to take in, deliver, and use more oxygen, which results in an increase in our VO2. Okay, so these 5 factors are very closely related to each other. Okay, the next presentation we'll look at our oxygen consumption patterns, and then we'll be able to move on to our cardiovascular responses to exercise.